Hey, all you cool plebs and patricians, and welcome to my kitchen, where today I'm going to be talking about Boudicca, the queen of the Iceni who stood up to Roman rule in Britain. She ranks up there with Mithridates and Hannibal as one of those iconic antagonists of Roman history, but she's also a deeply sympathetic figure. She doesn't represent a great state or rival empire trying to expand their own domain. She was just trying to free herself and her people from Roman dominion. But as we'll see, she'll be even less successful than her predecessor Caratacus in this. Her rebellion against Rome goes nowhere. So why do we remember her? Why does she have a statue built of her in London? Why is it that as a first introduction to history at the age of 8 in school, I was given a description of this tall Celtic woman carrying a spear with hair that went down to her hips? Well, to understand Boudicca and her importance to British history, we have to understand her story. So without further ado, let's set the scene. It's 58 CE, and the new governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paullinus, is looking over his new province. He's already had a very distinguished career. He'd fought a rebellion in Mauritania, he'd been the first Roman commander to ever march a legion across the Atlas Mountains, and he'd even served as consul under the Emperor Claudius. But the Emperor Claudius was gone. Nero was the new emperor now, and he wanted Paullinus to clean up the mess that was Britain. And Britain was a mess. The Romans had only been on the island for about 15 years at this point. One of Paullinus's predecessors as governor had even supposedly died of stress in an attempt to manage the island, as the local tribes stopped confronting the legions directly and started using guerrilla warfare more, often luring the legions in with excessive loot which they'd leave just lying around, and then when their guards were dropped, they'd ambush them. Roman rule on the island was seemingly becoming more unpopular as Roman practices towards the locals became increasingly cruel. It was no secret that after 15 years of guerrilla war, the Roman commanders were speaking about the Celts in terms of extermination, just like they had done in Gaul. They often referred to even pacified tribes who surrendered to the Romans as the slaves or the prisoners, regardless of their actual status. Tribes like the Trinovantes, who had been allied to Rome and in fact been the ones to invite them over a decade and a half previously, were themselves transplanted from their homeland, forcibly relocated, and had all their ancestral lands given to Roman veteran legionaries. There were also more than a few misunderstandings regarding finance. The Celts did not have the same complex financial institutions like taxes, the census, loans and interest as the Romans had. They were alien concepts to them. A good example of this is a few years prior, the Emperor Claudius had handed out huge loans to prominent Celtic leaders as part of both a bribe to get their loyalty and a kind of investment in the province. Here's some money in the form of a loan to build roads, forts, Roman institutions, as it were. But Claudius was gone, and Nero was emperor now. And the Emperor Nero, or at least his underlings, wanted that money back immediately. So the Celts, who couldn't pay, had to do so in the form of property confiscation, something that was apparently done very, very brutally. To exacerbate the situation, some senators had even begun some really predatory lending practices. To make a profit off these people who didn't have the same financial complexity as the Mediterranean world, they would give them loans with huge interest rates, and then without warning demand they be all collected at once. Apparently, very, very brutal methods were used to do this, and the Celts saw it as, well, for what it was, simple robbery. So this was the mess of a province that Paullinus would have to govern. So he set about identifying the problems and getting rid of them. And the first problem he identified was the existence of Druids. Druids were the scholarly, priestly class in Celtic society, and they were the ones fomenting a great deal of anti-Roman feeling. Allegedly, the Druids practiced human sacrifice, something that sickened the Romans. But in a more practical sense, the Druids that were gathering on the sacred Isle of Mona, modern-day Anglesey, were giving refuge to the Celtic rebels fleeing from the Romans. So Paullinus, recognizing that this was becoming a kind of safe haven for anti-Roman Celts, marched off with all of his legions to Wales. And so it was while most of the Roman legionnaires were in Wales that the king of the Iceni died. His name was Prasutagus, and he ruled this area of land here, with his wife, Boudicca, the hero of our story, finally making her entrance however long into this video we are now, and his 2 daughters. And he'd managed to keep his own people safe from the Romans, by striking a deal with them. When he died, his will said that half of his lands would be left to the direct rule of the empire, whilst the other half would be co-ruled by his daughters. And this was all well and good until the king actually died, and those Roman soldiers, who we've already established were loot crazy, came to collect their dues. Tacitus tells us that kingdom and household alike were plundered like prizes of war, the one by Roman officers and the other by Roman slaves. As a beginning, his widow, Boudicca, was flogged and their daughters raped. The Icenian chiefs were deprived of their hereditary estates, as if the Romans had been given the whole country, and the king's own relatives were treated like slaves. It's not really good reading for when you're having your breakfast. This is the great tragedy of Boudicca's life. What should have been the peaceful transfer of power between the Romans, her own daughters after the death of her husband, resulted in her own torture and the assault of her children and the loss of all of her possessions. And this is a major miscalculation by the Romans. Given that most of their legions were away in Wales with Paulinus at the time, it's clear that the empire was blissfully unaware of the undercurrent of resentment amongst the Celts towards their rule. So while Paulinus was away in Wales, the tribes of southern England met with each other, and now free from the fear of having the Roman legions so close, began to discuss just how awful their situation was. They talked about how back in the day they only owed loyalty to one leader, and now it's to two, their direct Celtic leader and their Roman overlords above them. How roaming gangs of centurions and Roman veterans just go across the land looting at will, attacking the populace of Britain and conscripting the young men to be soldiers in their army. Then, amidst all of these chiefs, stands up Boudicca, the widow of the king who had died and been betrayed, the mother of the two heiresses who had been raped, and a victim of Roman torture herself. We have a description of her appearance in Cassius Dio, which, bear in mind, is written about 150 years after her death, but is still the only description we have of what this Celtic warlord might have looked like. In stature, she was very tall. In appearance, she was terrifying. The glance of her eye was fierce, and her voice was most harsh. A great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips. Around her neck she wore a large golden torque, and she wore a tunic of many colours, over which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. This was her invariable attire, and she now grasped a spear in aid of terrifying all beholders, and spoke as follows. So Boudicca, whilst looking something like this...
With the bread knife on the stick and everything?
Well, yeah, I don't have an actual spear, do I?
You haven't even shaved.
Well, we have no evidence to suggest that Boudicca wasn't a bearded woman. I guess I can just draw her. So Boudicca, whilst looking like this, made her speech. She said, "The Romans haven't been here that long. We still remember what it was like to be free. We are now subject to taxes, not only to our leaders, but to their Roman overlords too. Instead of simply enslaving us, they make us buy back their empty title of freedom each year. We cannot work with the Romans. If this is how they treat us now, I can't imagine it'll get better with time. For when a man tames an animal, he knows that he must treat it with kindness in order to win its loyalty." So Boudicca and the Iceni revolt, and they're joined by the Trinovantes of all people, the original allies of Rome who had invited them over to the island in the first place. This shows just how much they'd come to deeply regret their decision. And they choose as the leader of their new rebellion, Boudicca, of course. Well, kind of not of course. I mean, Boudicca wasn't actually a queen. She's often referred to as Queen of the Iceni, and often the great tragedy of her life is when she has her inheritance taken from her. But she was never meant to be queen. Her daughters were. Maybe Boudicca was put in charge not because she was the rightful queen of the Iceni, but because the Celts were doing something they'd never done before. They were largely united. She commanded an army that was larger than Caratacus ever had before the Celts were even conquered. Maybe this was a call to forget about the old traditional way of doing things and adapt to face this new Roman threat. Boudicca in her speech makes an appeal to the Celts to do what they have never done before, to unite. She calls them all her friends and kinsmen, for they share a common island and a common name, so they are all her kinsmen. Which sounds to me like a call to end old feuds and old divisions and unite as Celtic Britons. After all, Vercingetorix, the guy who the Gauls unified behind 100 years earlier to resist Roman rule, had kind of totally transformed his society and his traditional way of doing things in order to adapt to this new threat. There's no reason to believe that the Celts in Britain and Boudicca couldn't do the exact same. But enough of what the rebellion might have looked like. Let's get into what it did. Deep in the land of the Trinovantes tribe that had been seized by the Romans to turn into a veterans colony was the settlement of Camulodunum. Not only was this home to a number of Roman veterans and legionnaires who had been the ones mistreating the Celtic people so much, it was also the site of construction for a new temple to the Emperor Claudius, who now after his death was being worshipped as a god. Seeing as Claudius was the emperor who had ordered the invasion of Britain in the first place, Tacitus tells us that this temple to him was the most offensive symbol of foreign rule in the country at the time. And so Boudicca and her Celts moved to destroy Camulodunum. And the local residents of the town are absolutely terrified. Even before Boudicca's revolt had started, the statue of Victory that was in the middle of Camulodunum had fallen over, and it had fallen face first, as if running away from a potential foe. This may not seem like much to us, but the Romans were an intensely superstitious people. I kid you not, wars could stop and start according to which types of bird land in which place on certain days. That's the kind of people we're dealing with here. So obviously the citizens of Camulodunum appeal to the soldiers still in the area for help defending their town. And help does come, in the form of 200 unarmed men, which is useless. It's just more mouths to feed. Like, for God's sake, Rome, get it together. How do you conquer the world? How do you conquer the world with this kind of attitude, hey? Fucking ridiculous. So Boudicca and her army reach Camulodunum, and it's very bad news for the Roman settlers. The Celts surround the town completely, and the Roman defense is completely ineffective. The Celts move in and butcher absolutely everyone they see. Now, it's possible that the Roman sources detail the really nitty-gritty bits of what Boudicca's army does to make the rebellion look worse, but in every other place, Boudicca's rebels act very, very brutally, and the sacking of a town is very rarely a pleasant affair. So according to the Roman sources, during the sacking, Boudicca and the other Celtic war chiefs gathered together a great deal of the Roman prisoners and made human sacrifices of them. On top of that, the noble women being taken out of Camulodunum were tied up, had their breasts amputated, and were made to either eat them or had them sewn to their face. Yeah. A lot of impaling went on. The Celts loved, and ancient peoples generally love putting sticks through people. It's just an aesthetically pleasing way of executing someone, I suppose. So yeah, sorry, I know I said Boudicca was a sympathetic figure, and she is, but she's still an ancient warlike Celt. So yeah, the Celts didn't take prisoners. The Roman survivors gather in the centre of the town where the Temple of Claudius is and get within the sacrosanct grounds of the temple itself, believing that maybe the deified emperor or the sanctity of the ground, a temple, a sanctuary, would protect them. But it doesn't. The Celts surround the temple and kill everyone inside of it. One brave Roman commander, even though he's horrifically outnumbered, tries to march his few men to Camulodunum's aid. But on the road to the city, he's ambushed by a contingent of Boudicca's army, and his foot soldiers are completely wiped out. The commander and the very few horsemen who he had with him manage to get away and get to the nearest Roman fort, and they hold up in there, expecting a Celtic counterattack that never comes. Point is, any Roman relief force isn't happening anymore. By the time Paulinus hears news of what's happening in Camulodunum, he's still in Wales, and when he gets the bad news, he's already had a hell of a day. In an attempt to cross over to the island of Mona, him and his legionaries had been greeted on the beach by a number of Celts, including apparently shrieking women with crazy hair, casting spells and the likes, and the Druids, of course, who had their arms raised to the sky, attempting to harness divine power to get rid of the Romans, screaming like animals. And to be frank, this absolutely terrified the superstitious Romans. Paulinus has a solution to the Druid problem though. He kills them all, and he burns the island of Mona, and everyone on it, which, yeah. Romans are the civilizing force here, obviously. It's after committing this little genocide in Wales that Paulinus hears about all the chaos going on back in England. But when he gets back to country, he finds out that all of the Roman forces there have abandoned him. They've either been killed by Boudicca, or they've fled back across the channel for safety's sake. So he's left with barely 10,000 men to deal with this huge revolt. So Paulinus marches to Londinium, which was the humble beginnings of what would eventually become the hellscape of the city of London. And there he finds a relieved population, thankful that he's come to save them. But he reveals that he really can't stay. The Romans were entirely too heavily outnumbered, and they were really low on supplies. Paulinus knew that if he let himself get trapped in a city like Londinium, Boudicca would have the initiative, so he has to abandon it. He takes with him a couple of refugees, mostly men that he can arm to fight, but the women, the children, the elderly, and most of the population really, are all left behind, and Boudicca follows a few days later to massacre them all. Tacitus tells us that 70,000 Roman citizens, and presumably many more slaves and locals, were killed during this campaign of terror. Boudicca's army basically went from settlement to settlement, taking everything other than prisoners. But Boudicca was now having the same problem that the Romans were having a few years earlier, her army only really being interested in looting. Yes, they went from town to town, but only unarmed towns. Whenever they encountered a fort with Roman soldiers, even if they could overpower it, they very rarely bothered. Why do that when you can go and loot someone who can't fight back? So as time went on, Boudicca's army became slower and more weighed down with the things that they'd taken, the wealth, the riches of their campaign, whilst Paulinus was joined by those few Romans left on the island who had been held up in forts, and his supply issues meant that he was now really keen to press a battle on Boudicca. When Paulinus finally gets his battle, he's sure to choose his ground carefully. He puts his legions somewhere where they've got dense woodlands behind them, that way Boudicca will have to attack from the front. The Queen's not worried though. She's facing a little over 10,000 Romans, and she has potentially 230,000 Celts at her back. In fact, she's so confident that she's bought her wagon train. All of the British non-combatants, the children, the elderly, etc., and all of that loot that they've gathered from this entire season of pillaging, that comes with them, and the wagon train is lined up behind the Celtic army. Boudicca herself leads from the front, from the back of a chariot, where she makes a very famous speech saying, "I am not now fighting for my kingdom and my wealth. I am fighting as an ordinary person who has lost her freedom, my bruised body and my outraged daughters. Roman rapacity does not even spare our bodies. Old people are killed, virgins are raped, but the gods will grant us the vengeance we deserve. The Romans who have dared to fight us were annihilated. The others cower in their camps, or watch for a chance to escape. They will never face the roar of our thousands, much less the shock of our onslaught. Consider how many of you are fighting and why, and then you will win this battle or perish. This is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they wish." The first time I ever read that speech, I was like 8 years old in school, and it was in a horrible histories book called The Rotten Romans. So technically, that's the first literary historical source that I ever read. So, you know, special place in my heart. But it really does as well kind of give us the impression of what the Celts were fighting for. This feeling of elation that with their sheer numbers and might, they might overthrow their oppressors at this point. It's amazing. Cassius Dio tells us that the Roman commander Paulinus also gave a speech in which he too claimed that himself and the Romans were the real victims here. He incites the memory of the sacking at Camulodunum and the sacking at Londinium and all of the Romans who had been killed by Boudicca's rampaging army. He says of them, "Exact from them now, therefore, the proper penalty for these deeds. Let them learn by actual experience the difference between us, whom they have wronged, and themselves." Tacitus also gives us a version of Paulinus' speech in his account. Now, Tacitus' father-in-law, Agricola, with whom he was very close, he even writes a biography of him, actually fought at the battle. Later on, he'd become governor of Britain. So he'd have heard Paulinus' speech firsthand, so this account of what's said is probably more accurate. And he says, "Disregard the clamour and empty threats of the natives. In their ranks there are more women than fighting men. Unwarlike, unarmed, when they see the arms and courage of their conquerors who have routed them often, they will break immediately. What special glory for your small numbers to win the renown of the whole army. Just keep in close order, throw your javelins and then carry on. Use your shield bosses to fell them and your swords to kill them. Do not think of plunder, for when you have won, you will have everything." That speech is very imperialistic Roman indeed, very to the point, no nonsense, which is pretty characteristic of how the Romans will go about killing Boudicca's Celts, which they do with frightening efficiency. The Romans advanced in silence, enduring the taunts of the Celts and the missiles being thrown by their charioteers. As they get closer, though, they wait till all of the Romans can throw their pilum at once, creating this volley of shock. The Romans then let out their battle cry and charge in a wedge formation, and this has the effect of preventing the Celts from utilising their historically most dangerous tool, the massed charge. It was often the case when these Roman armies would face off against Celtic armies that initially it would look like the Celts would win, because this huge overwhelming mass charge could break a Roman line given half a chance. But if the Romans managed to hold that line just until that initial charge had run out of steam, their superior weapons and training and armour meant that usually they'd get the upper hand in the end. So Paulinus, by loosing all of his javelins at once and by initiating his own surprise sudden charge, had kind of taken the wind out of Boudicca's sails. He started the battle with the initiative, and he'd keep it throughout. When Boudicca responded by sending her charioteers in to attack the Romans and break up their ranks, he simply had his javelinmen and archers shoot them off their platforms, and then his infantry could go about methodically butchering their way through Boudicca's unarmoured foot soldiers. Boudicca's warriors couldn't retreat and regroup because, like I said, she brought her wagon train lined up behind her army, meaning their route out was blocked. So it became harder and harder to resist the Romans, panic spread and cohesion was completely lost. And according to Tacitus, complete massacre ensued. The Romans, in a horrific display of bloodletting, killed not only the combatants, but the women, the children, the elderly, everyone who was there. Even the pack animals that pulled the wagons were massacred. Boudicca manages to survive the massacre, apparently, although there wasn't much point because she dies shortly afterwards. Tacitus tells us in an attempt to kill herself, which works, she drinks poison, whilst Dio tells us she dies of an illness shortly after the battle. It doesn't really matter, she's dead, and this is the end of her rebellion. But the real killer here wasn't the Romans. Well, it was the Romans, they killed a lot of people. But what really broke the back of British resistance was famine. Because Boudicca had snatched up all of the adults to be a part of her rebellion, no one had planted seeds that year, and the little that had been planted was all taken to feed the legions. A couple of tribes tried to renegotiate with Rome now that it was clear that they'd won, but in their weakened state, with not many of them on the island, the legionnaires were even more ruthless than they had been beforehand. Anyone who didn't declare absolute loyalty to Rome had their lands completely destroyed, ravaged, burned, destroyed, the end of it. And that is the last gasp of native Celtic resistance in, well, at least this bit of the island of Britain. The end of Boudicca isn't the end of the Celts. In fact, Britain becomes a fairly distinct province in the Roman Empire for its fusion of Celtic culture with Latin Romanization. But the Celtic peoples never agitate for political independence again. They are solidly paying taxes to Rome from here on out. In regards to independent Celtic kingdoms, they would only continue in parts of the island that Rome would never reach, the very north of Scotland and Ireland, for example. Although Britain would sometimes break away from the rest of the empire and become a self-governing province for a while, it was never a revival of native ways. It was never overthrowing the Romans and putting the Celts back in power. It was always just a splinter state of the Roman Empire. And when the Romans finally leave permanently in 407, the locals don't rejoice at the end of foreign occupation. They send petitions and letters to the weak Roman emperor saying, please, please come back, which the Romans never do. The empire in the west falls a few decades later. And soon that unique Romano-British culture, that fusion of Roman and Celtic ways, is driven into the corners of the island, places like Wales and the very north of England, as new invaders come from Germany, the Saxons, Angles and Jutes. And as all of this happens, Boudicca's small rebellion seems less and less significant. She very nearly just became a footnote in the story of Britain, this unimportant blip of a rebellion led by some nearly forgotten queen in the history of the island. But she's not unimportant. She's one of the most famous ancient Celtic people there are. We have a statue of her in our capital city, and we teach school children about her. Why? Well, it's mostly thanks to Queen Liz. Not that one, when she was younger. Lizzie I was a huge fan of Boudicca, which makes sense, she probably related to her quite a bit. Boudicca was a queen of the Britons who attempted to resist the rule of the most powerful empire on earth, and Lizzie I was the Queen of England who more successfully resisted an invasion by the most powerful empire on earth. It also just so happened that during the reign of Elizabeth I, Tacitus, our main source for Boudicca, had just been kind of rediscovered in England, and there was this renewed interest in classics. Songs were written about Boudicca, poems were written about her. She even, one of Shakespeare's contemporaries even wrote her into a play. Even better, Liz learned from her spiritual sister the secrets of Celtic magic and developed the elixir for eternal life, which is why Elizabeth is still the Queen of England today, over 400 years later, or as we in Britain call her, the Great Ancient One. So yeah, the renewal of interest in Boudicca and her story really did start with Queen Elizabeth I, but it reached its peak in the 19th century when, believe it or not, England had a queen whose name meant victory again. So yeah, Queen Vic, who had zero sense of irony, held Boudicca up as a national hero, a sign of the British attitude and this never surrender idea. Of course, you know, looking at it realistically, I don't know whether or not Boudicca would have related more to the empress of the most powerful empire on earth that was busy ransacking the lands of native peoples, or to those native peoples, but that's neither here nor there. Victorian history usually suits what the Victorians want it to suit. She even got a statue in London dedicated to her, and if you look very carefully at the likeness of Boudicca, you'll see that she looks almost identical to a young Queen Victoria. The bloody light, it's like God doesn't want me to talk about Boudicca anymore. Boudicca and her story has, not surprisingly as well, garnered a lot of interest because it's simply rarer to have powerful women in history. And, much like her admirer, Elizabeth I, Boudicca's entire story is done from her perspective without a man even being involved at all. She does have a husband, but he dies before the main story, starts, which is kind of a bit of a parallel with Queen Elizabeth, who famously never married. And in modern feminism, Boudicca imagery is very common and has been basically since the start of the movement. The suffragettes, over 100 years ago, probably inspired by that statue that went up only a few years before their movement started, held Boudicca up as an icon as a British woman. And then on top of that, the existence of queens in Celtic society like Boudicca and her contemporaries like Mantua, added with the importance of women in a lot of Celtic mythology, really do act as a relieving change of pace when it comes to studying ancient history. Rome and Greece, which are the focuses for most ancient historians, are intensely patriarchal societies, and studying them can give you the impression that the entire ancient world was run only by men. But Boudicca and the Celts stand out as exceptions to that rule, and because of that they're interesting. In fact, for the last few hundred years of Boudicca being studied, the fact that she was a woman has often been really quite central as a point of interest. And the debate has gone on for a long time about whether or not this proves that women were as powerful, if not more powerful, than men in Celtic societies, or if Boudicca is just a figurehead, or a little bit of an invention in the imagination of Tacitus. A fair while ago, Boudicca was used as a kind of case study for what they believed was like this evolutionary way of looking at history, that societies all started as egalitarian, then they became matriarchal, and then patriarchal, and this idea that Celtic Britain was stuck in that matriarchal phase, which is nonsense, not only as a model for studying history, like societies don't work like this, but also doesn't really work when you look at Celtic society, where the Romans say they made no distinction between the sexes when picking their leaders, and although Boudicca was a queen and Mantua was a queen, Caratacus was the son of a king. Clearly they seem to have both male and female leaders, so anyone who's still having that argument, there's your answer. But I think the main reason that interest in Boudicca continues is because everyone loves an underdog story. Like, there's something so appealing about this tale of this warrior queen, this wronged warrior queen who wants to drive the invaders from her land. And when you read it, even knowing with the power of hindsight that her rebellion was doomed and will be a failure, you still get this little bit of hope that this queen who feels justified in her anger against Rome will this time get rid of the invaders. And that's why the story of Boudica will probably continue to be retold, and why she will probably continue to be held up as an icon in British history.
So what morals are you forcing on this story?
If at first you don't succeed, maybe in 1500 years a queen will be interested in your story, someone will write a play about you, and then a few hundred years down the line from that, someone will make a YouTube video about you. Look, I don't know what the moral to this story is. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, or potentially comment. You could share if you like. Well, the options are limitless. We live in this incredible, open, free world in which you can do anything provided you do it from the inside safety of your own home.
But they're also limited to those three things.
Yeah, okay. The options are limited, but somewhat broad.